Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Bill Sherman, and this is Leveraging Thought Leadership. My guest on the podcast today is Juliet Funt. Juliet is the CEO of Whitespace at Work. She's an accomplished keynote speaker, an advisor to Fortune 500 CEOs, and soon to be a published author. And today in the podcast, we're going to talk about the evolution of a platform across modalities. Welcome, Juliet.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. You started out as a keynote speaker, right?
Yes,
and
that's right.
Tell me a little bit about how you started in that space and some of the things you started talking about in your initial journey as a speaker.
So I think that there's such a long evolution here. I'm trying to decide how to consolidate it for smart purposes. But for about 10 years, I was a youth and education speaker when I first started, because the person who drew me into the industry was a youth and education speaker, and I did a lot of volunteer work with kids. So it just kind of made sense. And I ended up high schools, middle schools, eventually colleges, and then at the college platform started working with the teachers and the administrators as well, and realized that I liked speaking to grown-ups. There are youth and education speakers who are all basically big, giant, grown-up 11-year-olds, and they love staying in youth and education, but I wasn't one of them, and I was never a long-term match for that market. And so I started moving into associations, which then led into corporate. So that's a client-based evolution in terms of a content.
And thematically, what were you talking about as you moved to the association and corporations?
So in the youth stuff, I was talking about a number of different stress points for children. And one of them was this program called Overcommitted, Overwhelmed, and Over It, about kids being overloaded. And that led to talks about adults being overloaded, which led to general content.
So you're saying that kids who grew up wind up still being overloaded? You don't automatically at puberty solve everything?
No, it's amazing. Especially in Los Angeles and New York, where I did a lot of my work, where they're the highest pressure, highest end, high achieving families pushing their children to do these ridiculous amounts of activities. So that general topic of overload, stress, how much can you take on, sort of morphed into a program that I did on the keynote stage for years, and associations, and then for corporations. And it was the seed of Whitespace, our current content, but it wasn't formed yet.
So tell me a little bit about that. What was the seed, and when did you stumble upon the term white space? And we'll define it here in a moment. But when did you stumble on because I think the word came before the content, and you can correct me on that.
It was about the same time. So I was teaching a lot about, they always say that you teach what you need to learn. So you gravitate as an expert towards solving whatever your core problem is in your life. And then you go, wow, that was effective. Maybe I'll teach 1 million people to do that. And I think that's how a lot of people create content. So I am, as you know from working very closely together, a hyperactive, super busy, go Energizer Bunny type person. And where I've always needed more in my life is space to just step away and decompress. And so this idea of moving toward compartmentalizing work and effort so that you have oxygen in the system, I think always started from solving my own problem over and over, which then became an articulate journey, which other people became interested in, and that grew into the content. I think a lot of leaders gravitate toward the opposite of their biggest natural failing.
I think that's true, right? And so when you hear someone say they've become an expert in something, it's often because they've spent a lot of time figuring out and understanding on a deep level what is it I'm struggling with, and developing tips and tricks and solutions to help solve that problem. And shockingly, a lot of us struggle with the same challenges, right? So briefly, give me a quick definition of what is white space, because I know you and I can understand it.
Yeah, sure.
Define it for our listeners.
So the way that we think of it now, and it's evolved over time, is if you imagine the periodic table of the elements as a necessity for a stable universe, and then just imagine one or two of them just fell out, and all of a sudden there was no salt or there was no nitrogen. We believe that in a parallel that there's been an element of life and work that has been missing recently and for a little while, and we call that white space. And that element is the open, unscheduled, fluid time that used to live in between activities before they became seamless, before phones and technology filled in every gap, before all the pressures to never stop moving got more and more intense. And that white space, open time, a thoughtful little wedge of recuperation or strategy or creativity is what we teach. We teach how to return to a workplace and a life where there is white space, especially used interstitially. There is absolutely a white space application for beautiful 15, 20, 30-minute stretches, but that's not how most people apply the content. It's about a sip, like a little glass of water that sits on your desk, and every once in a while you just take a little sip.
That's a great definition, right? Is that white space is the moment to pause, to reflect and say,
right,
okay, what next, right?
We called it a strategic pause taken between activities, and that definition has pretty much stuck. Bill, I remember sitting together, wordsmithing over that for 100 hours, but a strategic pause taken between activities is the way that we define it. It can be a long
Very
pause or
cool.
a short pause.
Let's move forward in the sort of timeline. You're out on the speaking circuit and you're
Right.
giving keynotes related to white space. And
Right.
with a keynote, you've got your stories, you've got your anecdotes, you've got a great close to the keynote. People are loving it and going, oh my gosh, you've described my pain.
Yeah.
Why did you take the next step to documenting it and really defining what white space is?
Yeah, sure. So just so we missed a chapter in there that you wanted, which was the origin of the word. So just so you
Oh,
know,
yeah, please.
it came from three converging sources. One was just tactical when I was working with executives, that we would look at their calendars and we would look for white spaces. So if there was not any actual white on the physical calendar in between the colors, then that was a problem. And so the white space literally came from that. Then there were also some other influences from my personal life, which might take a little while, but the real derivation of the word came from that, just from the space. And that became a crystallization of things that I was already teaching. I was already teaching pauses. I was already teaching stepping back. I was already teaching the importance of recuperation, but then the word just brought it all together. And, I did not create a business out of this content in as much of an organized way as many have, or maybe as one should. I have always been a little bit of I have a lifestyle business, and I've always been a little, believe it or not, work resistant. Some people would say I'm a workaholic in some ways, but other people would notice that I pull back sometimes on growth in the way that other executives would push. I don't have the same hunger for breadth that a lot of people have in my company. I just want it to be helpful and serve just the right amount of people. So I didn't really do anything proactive. I was keynoting, I was happy. And I did something reactive, which was I was speaking at a large American Express conference, and someone said, how do you scale this? And I went, how do you scale this? And I actually ended up calling 2 or 3 people who led to Peter at Thought Leadership, and that's how I started scaling. But prior to that, it was dripping into my mind that we needed scalable versions. Before I met you guys, I was already playing with an e-course, which we then modified and created a different version of. I was playing around with paid recorded content. So it was germinating based on what everyone else was doing and how the zeitgeist of the industry was kind of moving toward that, and my own fear of not wanting a blank spreadsheet every January for the rest of my life where I had to populate it with keynotes.
Right. If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. So now let's talk about the time we first met. So I was going to come out and we were going to work on doing some work together on shaping the content, right?
Right.
And I think our first conversation was a phone call where I said, can you send me some things to look at? Right?
I
And
know where we're going with this, yeah.
Yeah.
And in my defense, I should say that this has always been the hardest part for me is I keep a Word document open called something like Great Ideas or Content or Speech Brainstorm. I have had these for 25 years, these repository documents, and I'm walking along. I got a great idea. I jot it down, it goes there. I walk along. And then what happens is I don't know what to do. As I think many creative people who generate a lot of content is the process of taking that from a 47-page document called Great Ideas to teachable content is really overwhelming when you work by yourself. And so
it's
when
popcorn ideation, you had so many good ideas.
Yeah. So it was very overwhelming, and it was great to have a partner to start parsing that out.
So I remember on that call,
I know where you're heading.
You said, because I asked, can you send something to me? And you said, no, but I'll walk you through it. I
Yeah.
think is the exact word. So I'm like, okay. So I get on a plane, I fly to LA, and we're meeting at the hotel, and
The
we're sitting
Avalon
actually
Hotel.
poolside. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's lovely. It's LA weather. And I'm like, okay, let's start the walkthrough. And so you reach into your bag
Yep.
and pull out what I can only guess was about a ream of paper with about 2 to 3 words per page.
Yes, I was going to give you a visual slideshow of idea number 1, idea number 2, idea number 437. I thought it would be good to just write
And
one idea per page.
and it was this tour through, what would you describe, 10, 15 years of collected popcorn ideation.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
remember looking at this, and you'd written with a Sharpie, and must have transcribed not only documents and files, but each of them was a rich idea where we'd have 3 words on the page, but you'd spend 5, 10 minutes trying to explain that single idea and
Yeah.
just doing page after page on that.
Now, if
So
if I had done that again, and some of your people will be earlier in their process, what I should have done is have a recorder running for the whole session and transcribe the descriptions, because that would have saved us tons of time in
mhm.
where we went. And that's what I do now, is everything is recorded and transcribed. But that would have been a
And
good,
it's
good
so
idea.
much easier to get transcription now than it was then, right? Because you can upload files and get them automatically transcripted, and they're
Right,
pretty good so that you can
right.
go back and search. Much, much more powerful. So, talk to me, because I know the story from my side, but in your side, talk a little bit about that preparation process, as well as then the collaboration of, starting to spar with someone over ideas that have been
Yeah,
running through your head for a long time.
yeah. Making the ideas stand still is the language that I use that's always been so intimidating to me. I've never had a hard time generating good ideas, but organizing them has been so. I mean, we sold a book to HarperCollins this year. I think I've
Mm-hmm.
been in my
Yep.
industry for 25 years with lots of ancillary pressure all over the place to write a book. But it is that problem that I have always had, is even making the ideas stand still enough to get a book proposal written was, it just basically pushed me off of it for 10, 15 years after the content was ready, where it could have been a book. Now for us, it's a gift because it's more ready now, and so it's better time. But on my side, I opened the document and I would go to an idea and I would sort of put it through a little A-B, 2 roads diverged in a wood in my head, and say, does this really feel juicy enough and special enough, or is this me just over generating ideas? And if it felt juicy and special enough, it would make the cut, and my hand would pick up one of those pieces of paper and take a Sharpie and write it on there for you. And there was also, I don't want to say laziness, but just that work overwhelm feeling of, I could have written out all the descriptions of those and sent them to you ahead of time, but it would have taken me weeks to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So verbally is always better for me. I'm a speaker. That's how I think, but it was easier for me to just write the ideas.
Well, and each 2 to 3 word sort of like Sharpie note had a story behind it, right? And you could often remember where you came up with the idea or what the
Yeah.
trigger was for it. And it was amazing how just those 2 to 3 words really were almost like improv. You had enough of a cue that it was
Yeah.
muscle memory,
Yeah.
memory
Yeah.
for you to
Yeah.
tell the story,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, where I'd like to go now is, once I sort of did the deep dive with you, we wound up trying to figure out what's the framework, what's the story underneath white space. And we landed on something we wound up calling the thieves of productivity. And I want to ask
Right.
you
Which we
about
still
that.
use. Yeah.
Yeah, can
Core.
you explain what they are, and then let's talk about how those came together.
Yeah, so I had a concept I was teaching for a long time on stage called the 4 horsemen of the corporate apocalypse. And it was emails, meetings, decks, and then you and I would go back and forth on what the fourth horseman
Fourth
should
one
be. So
was, yeah.
I would rotate different fourth horsemen into live presentations, experimenting with which one played the best. But this idea of the horsemen then evolved into the thieves of productivity in our work sessions. And I'm a big, big advocate. I don't know how often you do in your practice what I asked you to do, but I like to fly to a hotel room with a creative person, schedule a 10-hour day, bring in high-level snacks, and then just go, 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 go. And that's how I create everything. This COVID situation has been an interesting,
Yeah, there's power of being in the room,
but
especially when
being
you're
in the
working with
room
a wall of
together.
stickies.
And
Absolutely no whiteboard.
something with that, and you and I had a great flow with that. The whiteboard, the stickies, the depth, the long day, the inescapability of the hotel room. There's things that happen in there that don't happen in pieces, like in an hour call, an hour call, an hour call.
Mm-hmm.
So we just did that, and we hashed out the thieves, which came from the horsemen. Then we hashed out the simplification questions, which were the antidotes to the thieves. And that core frame of the thieves and the questions is still, it's about 10% of the book, and it's a core part of every single program, and it's part of our digital learning. So it's pretty central.
So let's talk about the evolution, because the once we had that framework, as you said, it started becoming something that you could hang tips, practices, ideas off of, because you needed a way to draw people into white space. And as you said, learning programs. And now it's moving to the book. So let's talk about the evolution as you're moving into the writing process. And where are you with manuscript at this point?
We submitted a V1 to Harper, and they were very, very sweet. About a week after COVID, they gave us 5 extra months without changing the pub date, because they knew that I was going to have to put my head down now with tactical business things and move off the book for a little while, which I have. I haven't touched it in 2 months since all this craziness erupted. So our pub date is August 21, and my new deadline now is November, which was very lovely and kind of them. They absorbed the rush part on their side of the process instead of mine. And we have a really good V1. I was really happy. We have a very, very lovely editor who's the head of Harper Business. I got the best one, Hollis, and she read the V1 and she said she loved it. And so I think we're in good shape.
Congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment for the first time out, especially first book, first V1 getting out. That's great.
Yeah, it was a really great call together. And I think the thing that I've learned, and maybe other content leaders, thought leaders can learn from this, is the one place that I fell down in the 10 years prior to this book was that I didn't ask for enough user stories of the content. And so now we're scrambling. We have all this great content, but we don't have enough proof stories. And there's 2 reasons that I've identified where that fell apart for me. One was that I had 3 children in a row during the 10 years when I was doing this. So when I would go to events, I would speak, I would shake hands for 30 minutes, and I would be on a plane, where a lot of other thought leaders and authors were hanging out for a day to say, how is that helpful to you? And how would you apply it? And tell me a story about the pain in your organization. And they were getting more of that content. The other problem is that we have a digital solution. So we teach to people that are very far away from us instead of being in a room where we can say, how is that helpful to you? What does it look like? Right. So, and then on just organizational fall down of not keeping enough of the wonderful stories that I've heard verbally over the last 10 years. So there was a big hole that I could help other authors avoid by being religious from the day you hear this forward of, get the use stories, get the application of content stories, and document them anywhere. They can be audio files that you just save and transcribe later, or that you jot down, or that you any way to get them. But that's been an enormous lift now. We're doing dozens of interviews going back to ask those questions. That was a learning curve that I could have avoided.
I think that's great advice. And to build on that, I think there's 2 pieces. One is the pain points. What were they struggling with? Why were they struggling? And then the stories of the journey and the success afterwards. So really thinking of it, not just the how did you solve the problem, but what led you to the solution, right?
It's also really hard when people like your content. It's very hard to get them to go underneath compliments. So I have 5,000 emails that say, that was so helpful, but that's all it says. So, you go back and you realize you didn't ask them, tell me 2 ways specifically that it was helpful. If I had an auto reply for every compliment in the last decade to just ask them 1 or 2 questions of specificity.
Can you please be specific as an auto responder?
Yeah. Or something like that.
So Juliet, this has been a wonderful conversation. And I think your advice in terms of collecting those stories rather than going forensically and trying to rebuild them is one that a lot of people who are doing content and thought leadership really can learn from. Thank you very much for taking your time today.
You're welcome.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please join our LinkedIn group, Organizational Thought Leadership. It's a professional community where thought leadership practitioners talk shop about our field. So if you're someone who creates, curates, or deploys thought leadership for your organization, then please join the conversation in the Organizational Thought Leadership LinkedIn